There is a woman who sits at a window in the hill country of the West, in a house that was not always hers to keep. She is older now, the kind of older that does not apologize for itself. Her hands are steady, unhurried, and they hold a bottle the way a woman holds something she earned, rather than something she was given. The glass is dark amber, the color of late October light pressing through a barn wall. The label is hand-lettered, a little uneven along the bottom edge, the ink faded to the pale rust of an old scar. It bears a name, her name. She does not look at the label. She knows what it says. Outside, the orchard rows run long and clean against the hillside, and the trees are full this year, thick with fruit that needs no apology. A wagon is pulled up near the cellar door. Somewhere below, there is the hollow sound of barrels being moved. The smell that drifts through the open window is warm and sharp and sweet, the kind of smell that announces itself with confidence, the way she herself once had to learn to do. She turns the bottle once more in her hands. Then she is still. The narrator might begin with the orchard, might speak of frost-bitten seasons and the particular silence of trees that have stopped trying, might describe the gray look of the surrounding town, the men leaning against the feed store posts, measuring their words as carefully as they measured her chances, which is to say, not very carefully at all. But the right place to begin is with what they called her. The girl fool enough to keep that cursed orchard. That was the phrase, not said once, not muttered quietly behind a hand, said plainly, in daylight, with the full comfort of a town that had already decided what the story was. She was an orphan. She had inherited a failing piece of hill land that had not produced a profitable harvest in 4 consecutive years. The apple trees were there. The cold was also there. And the cold, every year, had won. The town had done the arithmetic and arrived at an answer: she would sell. It was only a matter of when, and to whom, and for how little. There was a man in town, a prosperous man, the kind whose prosperity seemed to increase in proportion to other people's misfortune, who had already done his own arithmetic. He had already selected a price. He had already retained a lawyer. He was not in a hurry. People who are certain they will win rarely are. And she, the girl at the edge of the story that autumn, the girl whose name no one was writing down for any favorable reason, she was standing in a barn that smelled of bruised apples and old wood, looking at a row of her grandfather's barrels, and thinking, that is where it begins. Not with the frost, not with the loss, with a young woman, alone, thinking. The bottle on the windowsill catches the light and holds it. The autumn she is remembering now was the 3rd bad one in a row. That matters. 1 poor harvest is weather. 2 is misfortune. 3 is a verdict, and the town had long since delivered theirs. The trees themselves looked tired of the argument. They stood in their crooked rows along the hillside, bent at the joints the way old things bend when they have been asked too many times to bear more than they can hold. The apples had come in. They always came in, but they came in wrong. Bruised before they fell, split along seams no one had opened. Some had begun to soften on the branch before October had finished arriving, and what reached the ground was less fruit than memory of fruit. Brown-sided, weeping at the skin, wholly unmarketable. No buyer from the valley would make the trip up the road for them. No one had. By the 3rd year, they had stopped asking. She had walked the rows herself that morning, the morning he came, counting what was there. There was more than people said. There was always more than people said, when they were already certain of the answer and no longer looking closely. He came in the early afternoon. His carriage was the kind that announced prosperity before the man himself had to speak, and he spoke very well regardless. He brought a lawyer, as promised by the shape of the situation, a neat man with a neat coat and a leather satchel worn just enough to suggest experience. They were a matched pair, the buyer and his lawyer, the way a lock and key are matched, each made to serve the other's purpose. She met them at the door. She did not ask them in immediately. That pause, The few seconds in which she simply stood and regarded them from the doorway was not discourtesy, it was information. She was reading them, and they did not know they were being read. He opened pleasantly. He always opened pleasantly, she imagined, the way a trap is pleasant on its surface before the mechanism is understood. He spoke of the frost. He spoke of the difficulty of farming hill country. He spoke of the losses she must have sustained, and his voice carried the particular texture of sympathy that contains no actual sorrow. Then he named the price. It was a number. She heard it. She held it in her mind and turned it over, examining the weight of it, the shape of it, the precise degree of its insult. It was not quite low enough to be laughed at. That was the craftsmanship of it. It was low enough to reduce her, but not so low she could point to it and call it dishonest. The lawyer's pen was ready. She looked at it. She looked at him. She said she would need time to consider, in a voice so even and so courteous that he could find no purchase on it. He was not concerned. He expected this. He had time. She thanked them both and closed the door. She stood with her back against the closed door for a long moment after their footsteps crossed the porch and faded down toward the road. She did not move until she heard the carriage wheels begin to turn, until the sound of them diminished into the ordinary quiet of the afternoon. Then she breathed. Outside, the orchard waited. It always waited. That was the particular patience of trees. They did not hurry for anyone, not for frost, not for buyers, not for grief. They stood, and they bore what the season brought them, and in the bearing they said nothing, and in the nothing they said everything. She put on her coat. The air that afternoon was the kind that comes in early October in hill country, not yet cold enough to bite, but cold enough to remind you that biting is coming. The light sat low and amber across the rows, throwing long shadows between the trees, making the whole orchard look like something remembered rather than something real. She walked into it. She walked each row, slowly. The way her grandfather had walked them, she had been told, though she had not been old enough to walk with him, not for long enough. Row by row she went, hands at her sides, reading the ground the way another person might read a letter written in a difficult hand. The fallen fruit was everywhere. She had known it was everywhere. She had seen it from the house, from the barn door, from the road. But seeing from a distance and seeing close are different acts, and she was close now. The bruising was complete on most of them. Frost darkened, soft at the edges, split where they had struck the ground. Worthless by every measure she had been given. The kind of thing a man who dealt in numbers would look at and see only subtraction. She crouched near a cluster of them, gathered against the base of a tree where the roots had raised the ground into a small natural hollow. They had been there some days. The skins were broken. The flesh had begun to go translucent at the edges, that particular amber deepness that came with fermentation. And she knew that word because her grandfather had used it, though she had been young and had not understood it fully, had only understood the smell. The smell reached her now, sharp, sweet, not the sweetness of fresh fruit, which is surface sweetness, which sits on the tongue and releases and is gone. This was something deeper, a sweetness with heat under it, with memory under it, with process under it. It rose from the broken skins of ruined apples and filled the cold orchard air, and it was not the smell of rot, not precisely, though it walked beside rot the way shadow walks beside light, always close, never identical. She stood. She stood and looked at the old barrels along the barn wall, their staves gone dark with years of weather, and something shifted in her, quiet and total, the way a door shifts when a key finally finds its proper angle. She did not go to the barrels that evening. She went inside. She lit the lamp, she sat at the table where her grandfather had sat for 40 years, and she looked at her hands, which were cold, and smelled faintly of apple skin, and turned earth, and she did not make a decision so much as she allowed a decision to settle over her the way frost settles, quietly, completely, without asking permission. In the morning, She went to the cellar. The door was set into the far side of the barn floor, heavy oak gone dark as iron, fitted with a latch that had not moved in years. The key was on the nail where he had always kept it, and the nail was where it had always been, and this small constancy, that the nail had held, that the key had not been lost, that some things survived the people who placed them, steadied her more than she would have expected. She lifted the key. It was cold. She carried it to the door and worked the latch until it gave, and then the cellar exhaled. There is no other word for it. The cold air rose past her in a slow exhalation, carrying with it the smell of seasons she had not been present for. Dark seasons, wet seasons, the compressed memory of every autumn that had passed over this land, and left something of itself behind in oak and stone and earth. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of patience, she would think later, though she did not think it then. Then she only breathed it in and went down the steps. The press was there. It stood against the far wall as it had always stood, its wooden frame worn pale at every surface that a hand had ever touched, its iron screw intact, its catch basin cracked along one edge but still functional, she thought, still capable. And the barrels, her grandfather's barrels, lined the cellar in 2 rows, their staves tight despite the years, their interiors still smelling of what they had held before, something dark, something amber, something that had once been fruit and become, through patience and process, and the particular alchemy of time, something else entirely. She moved through them slowly. She pressed her palm to the nearest stave and felt the cold of old wood and old seasons, and something beneath that, something she could not name, but recognized the way one recognizes a voice before one can place the face. She told no one. Not the woman at the dry goods counter who watched her buy extra cheesecloth with mild curiosity. Not the man at the far edge of the next property who occasionally crossed the fence line on his way to the road and sometimes lifted a hand in passing, no more than that, acknowledgement without intrusion, which she had come to regard as the most decent form of neighborliness. Not the minister who asked after the orchard on Sunday, with the particular gentleness of someone who has already written a thing off. She told no one. She went back to the cellar and she began. The work began before the town was awake, and ended long after it had gone to sleep. She had learned the rhythm of it inside the first week, not from any book, for there was no book, and not from any instruction, for there was no one to instruct her. She had learned it the way the orchard itself had once learned to grow in rocky soil, by repetition, by failure, by the slow accumulation of understanding that comes only from doing a thing again and again in the dark until it begins to feel like knowledge. October pressed itself against the hillside in long, cold sheets of gray light. The mornings arrived early and departed late, which is to say, they did not depart at all, only deepened. She worked by lantern from before dawn until the lantern oil grew thin, and then she banked the fire, slept a few hours on the cot she had moved near the cellar entrance, and began again. The pressing was hard work. Not cruel, but honest. The kind of labor that tells you exactly what it costs and gives you back exactly what you spent, no more. Her arms ached. Her back registered every hour. The smell of crushed apple and fermenting sugar became so familiar that she stopped smelling it altogether, the way one stops hearing a clock once one has lived beside it long enough. The town, for its part, had not stopped smelling it. She heard, in fragments, what was being said. The dry goods woman had mentioned it to the minister's wife. The minister's wife had mentioned it to someone else. By the 3rd week of October, the general consensus, delivered in the careful tones people use when they are saying something unkind, with the face of concern, was that the girl had gone to meddling with something she did not understand, and the smell coming off that barn was proof enough of what came from letting grief make a person reckless. She heard this. She pressed another barrel. There was, at the edge of her awareness, the fact of her neighbor. He occupied the next property along the road, a tradesman, quiet in the way of men, who have decided long ago that most conversation is not worth the breath it costs. He had never done more than lift a hand when they passed in range of each other, and she had received this as the correct and sufficient form of acknowledgment it was meant to be. But one morning in the 3rd week of October, she came up from the cellar at first light and found a cord of split firewood stacked neatly at her gate. No note, no knock, no accounting for itself in any way except presence. She stood in the cold and looked at it for a long moment. Then she went back inside and added 3 more logs to the stove, and the barn held warmth it had not held before, and by evening the fermentation in barrel 4 had advanced further than barrel 3 had at the same stage, which told her something useful about temperature. She did not stop working. The smell reached town before she did. She had not gone to town. She had no reason to, but the smell, sharp and sweet and fermented, amber in character, ancient in the way that living things turning into other living things are always ancient, traveled the road ahead of her on mornings when the wind ran east. By the 4th week of October, it had become a subject of some civic concern. At the general store, the women spoke of it the way they spoke of things that offended them without quite offering permission to be offended. They turned their faces slightly as they said the word smell, as though the word itself carried traces of it. One said it reminded her of something she could not name and did not wish to. Another said she had noticed it from her porch on Tuesday and had gone inside with some promptness. They agreed that whatever was happening out there, and no one wished to say it plainly, was not quite right. The orchard had always been trouble, the family had always been peculiar, and now there was a young woman alone out there, doing something the nature of which no one could confirm but everyone could detect, and that was precisely the kind of thing a community was entitled to find unsettling. The deacon, for his part, offered a more formal interpretation. He mentioned the curse. He used the word carefully, with the particular delicacy of a man who wishes to float an idea while maintaining the dignity of not quite owning it. He said the land had resisted harvest for 3 consecutive years. He said there were things in this world that resisted good Christian effort and rewarded nothing but departure. He did not say she should leave. He simply allowed the silence that followed to carry the argument for him. The land buyer, meanwhile, was not at the general store. He was in his office, which smelled of wood smoke and good tobacco, with his lawyer seated across from him and the unsigned deed lying on the desk between them like a patient waiting its turn. He said he had given her sufficient time. He said a young woman in her position would reach a point where cold and isolation and the absence of any reasonable income would clarify her thinking considerably. He said she would come to him before the first snow. His lawyer wrote this down, as though it were a legal prediction rather than the ordinary vanity of a man who had never once been wrong about a property he wanted, and had therefore never developed the useful skill of imagining he might be. The narrator, watching all of this from the comfortable distance of years, finds the scene quite beautiful in its way. There is a specific grace to certainty that has not yet struck its wall. The town was so sure, the deacon was so sure, the buyer was so sure that the deed would be signed before winter that he had already decided what he would plant in the spring. And in her cellar, barrel 5 was ready to be sealed. She did not wait for him to come to her. That was the part the town never quite understood, not at first. They had been watching her windows for signs of surrender, a light burning too late, a figure walking the road toward town with her head bent, the small and recognizable posture of a woman who had finally done her accounting and found herself short. They had been patient about it, patient the way people are patient when they are certain of the ending. She chose a Tuesday, no particular reason for Tuesday, except that the roads were dry and the morning had a thin, cold clarity that made distances look shorter than they were. She loaded 3 jars into the back of the wagon, wrapped in burlap to keep them from knocking, and she drove toward town without announcing herself to anyone. She did not go to the buyer's office. She went to the first tavern on the county road, a low building with a porch that tilted slightly east, as though the whole structure had been leaning into the wind for 20 years, and had simply stayed that way. The man behind the bar was not unkind. He was also not credulous. He had heard about the orchard. Everybody had heard about the orchard. He let her pour, because it cost him nothing to let her pour, and he stood with his arms crossed in the posture of a man performing fairness. Then he tasted it. She watched his face do the thing faces do when something surprises them against their will, a small rearrangement, private and involuntary, the kind a person cannot manufacture. He set the glass down. He looked at it. He picked it up and drank the rest. She said very little. She had not come to argue. The second tavern was harder. The owner was a skeptic of a more organized variety, the kind who had objections arranged in order and ready to be delivered. He mentioned the orchard. He mentioned the frost. He mentioned, with some delicacy, that he had heard the smell coming from her barn was not encouraging. She poured without comment. He tasted without comment. There was a pause that lasted approximately long enough for a man to quietly revise an opinion he had not known he held quite so firmly. He asked how much she could deliver by November. She told him. By the third tavern, something had shifted in her posture that was not quite pride. Pride is too loud a word for it. It was more like the particular steadiness of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down in the right place. The owner of the third tavern did not need convincing at all. He had cousins in 2 of the other counties, he said. He could make introductions. She drove home in the afternoon light with 3 orders folded inside her coat and the empty jars rattling softly behind her, and the road back to the orchard looked nothing like the road that had brought her in. The road home was longer than the road out had been. Not in distance. The miles were the same, the ruts the same, the particular lean of the fence posts the same where the wind had been at them for years. But going out, she had carried uncertainty like a second coat, stiff and ill-fitting. Coming back, she carried only the folded orders and the quiet had a different weight entirely. She unhitched the horse herself in the early dark, the last of the light sitting low on the hill behind her like a lamp being slowly turned down. The barn smelled of what it had been all autumn, fermentation and cold wood, and the faint sweetness that had made her neighbors walk the far side of the road. She had stopped noticing it weeks ago. Now she thought it smelled like proof. She did not go inside the house right away. She went down into the cellar. She stood there in the lantern light for a long moment, looking at what she had made. The barrels lined up in the dark, like something patient that had been waiting for permission to be seen. The amber was invisible in this light. The barrels were just barrels, plain and old, her grandfather's good work still holding after all these years. But she knew what was inside them. She had pressed it herself. She had tended it herself. She had sat in this cold room on nights when the whole enterprise seemed more stubborn than sensible, and she had stayed anyway. She sat down on the low stool her grandfather had kept there for no particular reason, and she opened the tin box she had brought with her from the wagon. Inside, a small brush, a pot of ink, a stack of blank paper cut to size, and a pen she had bought the same day she bought the first glass jar, which was to say, the same day she decided. She wrote, in a careful, unhurried hand. Her name first. Not her grandfather's. Not the land's old name, which other people had given it. First admiringly and then with pity, and eventually with something worse than pity. Her own name, the one she had been given and had kept through everything that had been taken from her. Below it, the season. Below that, 2 words, the orchard's name, her name for it now. She let it dry before she pressed it to the first finished barrel. She smoothed it down with the flat of her hand, slowly, the way you smooth a letter you have written and will not take back. The lantern threw shadows up the wall. Outside, something shifted in the wind. A branch, probably, or a gate not quite latched. But she didn't look up. She was still looking at the label, at her own name in her own handwriting, on something she had made in a place that was hers, in a season that everyone else had already written off as lost. She reached for the next blank label and began again. She finished the last label sometime past midnight, when the lantern had burned low enough to make the shadows lean. In town, a different kind of conversation had begun, the kind that moves through a place the way wood smoke moves, low and quiet, and without a clear point of origin. Someone at the Harmon Tavern had mentioned a new cider, amber-colored, sharp and clean, not the sweet syrupy thing you got from the larger operations to the south, but something older tasting, something that reminded a man of the way good things used to be made. Someone else had heard the Kellner brothers over in the next county were already on their second order. The name on the label was unfamiliar to most of them, which meant it was a name that hadn't yet been worn down by familiarity into something ordinary. The land buyer heard it on a Thursday, standing outside the assay office while his lawyer sorted through some unrelated paperwork. A man passing on the street mentioned it the way men mention things they find mildly curious. A new cider, moving faster than expected, out of the hill country somewhere east of town. The land buyer nodded politely and thought nothing more of it. He had no reason to think of her. In his mind, she was already a concluded matter, a young woman, alone, in possession of a piece of land that had failed her and everyone before her, waiting for the practical mercy of a fair offer. He had been generous, he believed. Generous was the word he used when he thought about it, which was not often. He had other holdings, other negotiations, other land that needed tending. She was one item on a longer list, and the item was nearly crossed off. He wrote the letter on a Friday morning in the efficient way of a man who expects his letters to produce the results he has already decided upon. He named a date 3 weeks out. He mentioned the lawyer would accompany him again. He did not ask whether the date suited her. It did not occur to him that it might not. The letter reached her on a gray Tuesday afternoon, carried up the road by the same post-rider who had once looked at the orchard with undisguised skepticism and said nothing because there was nothing kind to say. She read it at her kitchen table, standing, still in her work coat. She read it once. She set it down beside the salt cellar, smoothed the edge of it flat with one finger, as though correcting a small wrinkle, and then turned back to the window where the hill was going copper in the last of the afternoon light. She did not reply. There was nothing she needed to say in a letter that could not be said better in a cellar, with the smell of good cider in the air and her name already on every barrel. They came on a Wednesday, which was the day she had expected. The sky was low and colorless, the kind of morning that flattens the hills and makes distances hard to read. She heard the carriage before she saw it, wheels on the frozen ruts of the road, the particular sound of a vehicle too fine for country tracks, and she set down her work without hurrying and wiped her hands on her apron with the deliberate calm of someone who has already decided how the next hour will go. She met them at the gate. He stepped down from the carriage first, dressed as before in his dark coat, his hat level, his expression that of a man arriving to conclude a formality. The lawyer followed with his case tucked under one arm, already reaching for the latch of it, as though the paperwork were a courtesy he had already mentally filed. They exchanged pleasantries in the way of men who do not consider the pleasantries necessary. She listened. She nodded once. Then she said she had something to show them first. He looked at her with the mild impatience of a man whose time has been arranged in advance. He said he was sure they could see to any particulars after the matter was settled. She said, quietly, that she believed he would prefer to see it before. There was a pause. The lawyer glanced at him. He glanced at the barn. She led them down. The cellar stairs were stone, worn smooth at the center from decades of boots, and the air shifted as they descended, first cool and still, then something else entirely. The lawyer went last, ducking slightly under the low lintel. The buyer reached the bottom step and stopped. The smell was not what either of them had prepared for. It was not the sharp, sour stench that had drifted over the hill all autumn, the smell the neighbors had waved away from their doorways, and described to each other with grimaces and brief, satisfied words. This was something else, something warm and rounded and faintly golden, something that suggested autumn without apologizing for it, something that occupied the cold air of the cellar the way a good fire occupies a room, quietly, completely, without asking permission. The barrels stood in rows against the far wall. Each one was sealed. Each one wore a small paper label, hand-lettered, neat, bearing a single name. Her name. The lawyer uncapped his pen. It was reflex. The meeting, the table, the document. Then his hand stopped. He looked at the barrels. He looked at the labels. He looked at the buyer. The buyer stood still. Whatever speech he had brought with him, whatever arrangement of words he had assembled in the carriage on the way out, whatever he had planned to say once the pen was moving and the deed was in hand, it had gone quiet somewhere in the amber-smelling air. He had not expected this. She did not let the silence hold long. That was one of the things he had not accounted for, among the many things he had not accounted for. Silence, in his experience, was a tool of acquisition. He had learned to use it the way other men used paperwork. Let it stretch, let it pressure, let the other party grow uncomfortable enough to accept whatever terms were offered, simply to fill the air again. But she had grown up in quiet. She had spent an autumn in it, alone in a barn cellar, listening to nothing but the slow breath of fermenting barrels and the particular silence of a woman who has decided she is not going to lose. She moved past him without hurry, crossed to the nearest barrel, and laid 3 folded papers across the top of it. The documents made a soft, flat sound in the still air. Purchase orders, signed. County tavern stamps at the bottom of each one. She had not hidden them, had not built to the moment, had not waited for the right dramatic pause. She simply set them down the way a person sets down something that belongs there. Then she told him the price. It was her price, not a negotiating number, not an opening figure with room built in for his counteroffer. It was what the land was worth, what it had always been worth, what frost and gossip and the long patience of waiting had not changed. And she said it with the same plainness she had used all autumn, the same tone she used when speaking to the ground or to the barrels, or to herself on mornings when there was no one else to speak to. He could match it or leave. She said that too, not unkindly, simply accurately. The buyer looked at the orders. He looked at the number she had named. Something moved across his face. Not quite humiliation, not quite respect. Something unnameable that lived between the two. The expression of a man who has arrived prepared for a transaction and discovered he has walked into something else entirely. His mouth opened. It closed. He looked once more at the rows of barrels, at the hand-lettered labels, at the uncapped pen still resting in his lawyer's hand, like a question no one had answered. He could not match it. He left. The lawyer recapped his pen, tucked the unsigned document under his arm, and followed without a word. Their footsteps crossed the cellar floor, climbed the wooden stairs, and disappeared into the gray autumn light above. She waited until she could no longer hear the carriage wheels on the frozen road. Then she turned back to the last barrel in the row, the one nearest the wall, the one she had been saving, and picked up the mallet and the cork she had set aside that morning. She did not smile. She simply returned to work. There was still one barrel left to seal. The mallet struck once, clean and certain. The cork held. She set the mallet down on the barrel's curved side and stood in the quiet of the cellar for a long moment, listening to the nothing that had replaced the sound of carriage wheels. The lantern light moved faintly across the rows of sealed barrels, each one full, each one labeled in her own hand, each one already spoken for. The smell of the place had changed over the course of that autumn. It had started as something the neighbors pressed their sleeves against, something that drew comment and laughter from the road. It had become something else entirely. She could not have named the exact morning when it crossed from embarrassing to remarkable. She only knew it had. She picked up the lantern and climbed the cellar stairs for the last time that season. Years settle strangely on certain people. They do not age them so much as deepen them, the way good timber darkens, the way cider itself grows quieter and more complex in the barrel over time. The woman who sets a bottle on the windowsill on a November morning is older now, and the light that comes through the glass is the same kind of pale autumn light that came through her grandfather's barn door on the morning she found the barrels. She has not forgotten that morning. She has simply stopped needing to explain it. The bottle on the sill is the first season cider. She has kept it all these years, not as a monument to anything, not as proof of anything, but because some things deserve to be held on to. The amber color has deepened. The glass catches the light and throws it back in warm, quiet pieces across the sill. Behind her, in the chair nearest the hearth, the man who once left firewood stacked at her gate, without announcement or explanation, is older too. He says nothing now, same as he said almost nothing then. It was a language she learned to read early, the language of someone who lets their actions speak in full sentences while their mouth stays still. He does not look at the bottle. He does not need to. He knows what it is. Some things require no ceremony. Some things need only to be witnessed, which is a different matter entirely. The town that once held its nose walks up her gate road every autumn now. They bring their coins and their jugs, and they wait in the kind of patient line that only forms for things people have come to believe in. The orchard still stands, the barrels still fill, the labels are still written in the same hand they always were. Her name, not his, not the land buyer who arrived with a lawyer and departed with nothing, not the town that laughed until it tasted. Hers. It was always hers. She simply declined to let anyone forget.